All right. Hi, Jim Dronenberg here, and Katz and Dan. Um, Tim is by this time an old friend. Um, I saw an article he had written in, I think it was Fine Gardening, some years back when I was reading some old magazines, and got in touch with him. And lo and behold, he had a wholesale bare root nursery in Ohio. And I said, "Oh, isn't this nice?" And I got in contact with a club member who shall be nameless, and worked with that club member's wholesale license. And we have been for, oh, what, 5 years now? Getting club order from Tim Brotzman's, well, the Brotzman's nursery, because it's you and your brother that own it together, isn't it?
My
But
brother, sister, my wife, my daughter. It's all family.
so the Brotzman Family Nursery, and Tim has been a mine of information, and he's spoken to us before. We know he's a good speaker, and with that, I'll turn it over to Tim.
Okay, Uncle. Thank you, Jim and Olivia, and all of you who helped, me make the technical advances to get this screen up and running. Let's see how well I can navigate it. But right, it's there's quite a few pictures I want to show today, so I'm going to move right into it. And obviously, this is called the Quest for New Plants. And as I was saying to Olivia before we began recording, there's certainly no one story. There's no one quest. Every one of us as plants people and lovers of plants have our own version of what we've done or hope to do and will continue to do as far as discovering plants that are new to us and exciting to us, and whether or not we're doing it passively or actively out in the field or just however we're going about it. There are certainly lots of roots and lots of stories and lots of books that have been written about these types of quests. Now, obviously, in the beginning, certainly nomadic peoples, as they travel from place to place, would recognize the value of certain fruit or nut producing trees and would carry those along with them. And so those caravan routes or those nomadic routes would undoubtedly have sort of rest areas or way stations of sorts, maybe an oasis or two, where some of this stuff would be cared for, or even maybe just accidentally planted just by dropping the seeds and berries. But the plants would obviously be there where they hadn't been before. And this sort of became a catalyst or a mark where people would stop and pause longer, and then after a period of time deliberately begin to create these places. And so these types of routes oftentimes became the principal ways that early plants were beginning to be moved back and forth. More, not so much for ornamental as we see them today, but for the agronomic value in them. And so there's a good chance that gardens have been with us ever since we started to settle down and cultivate crops. But it's also very possible that some of these gardens predated our settlements of civilization. One of the areas that always gets everybody's attention because it's a story that's commonly known, and that is the tulip mania that occurred in the 1500s, late 1500s, early 1600s. And as noted with this picture here, the Flemish herbalist and Austrian ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, whose name I won't even try to pronounce, he sent tulip seeds and bulbs to Vienna, Austria in 1554. In 1593, botanist Carlos Clusius brought his collection, a lot of plants of herbal nature, but a great collection of tulips as well. He brought those to the University of Leiden, including a tulip called Zomerschoen, which was Dutch for summer beauty, a very late flowered tulip. And this plant is one of the few of the really, not even heirloom, but the very first almost primordial tulip cultivars in the trade, then is still in the trade today. Clusius became the director of the Hortus Botanic, and in speaking to a friend, Carla Poina, who you'll see photographed later in this program. Carla has been working at the Hortus for probably 50 years, and she said that when Clusius arrived there at age 67, he was lame and of some sort of French nobility, and he probably wouldn't have been a man to very much get on his knees and do much true gardening. He probably had his his subordinate, whose name she gave me, becomes the actual person who built the Hortus. But still, Clusius was the man who began the Hortus Botanic about 1601. And in his memory, we have the lady tulip, Tulipa clusiana, which is a marvelous, marvelous, beautiful plant. And I think it's more specifically native to Afghanistan. But it wasn't because of the lady tulip that we remember Clusius. It's because of this particular tulip. Again, Zomer shown, because this plant here is part of that group of tulips that caused a great raving tulip mania. The more broken the colors, the more wild the colors in those tulips, the more money they commanded. And I realized at the time was that it was a color break was because of a virus. And apparently this is one of those old plants where I guess, I don't want to say the virus is still there, but the virus hasn't caused this one to basically sort of peter out and disappear and become diminished and weak. I don't want to say, I asked my Dutch friend today, is this plant still virus infected? He didn't have an answer, but one of the textbooks I read said that it did. I don't know the answer to that. But the tulip mania really hit its peak between 1634 and 1637. And as this note here indicates, in 1636, tulip could sell for 3,000 guilders, equal to 200 times a skilled worker's income. Now, Carla told me today that down here on the bottom, this particular Dutch phrase said the weight was, and it was 410, and the word is AASE. It is a unit of measure specific for tulip bulbs. So this particular bulb, Viceroy, weighed 410 of this assays, and it fetched 3,000 guilders. An older bulb that weighed 658 of these units fetched 4,200 guilders, an enormous sum of money. The most famous of all of the tulips of this particular grouping was Semper Augustus. So imagine that this particular fad, this mania, became a part, maybe part of and independent of the Dutch commerce. It became sort of symbolic of the wealth that the Netherlands and the Dutch merchants were gathering at that time. But in 1637, when it collapsed, people were left with perhaps 5% of the original investment. Following that, beginning to a bit more organized routes of plant selection and introduction. And I'm going to speak about 4 or 5 individuals here, and this body of text really isn't relevant as far as all the details. There's just not enough time and reason to read it all. But von Siebel was a very, very famous fellow. I thought he was Dutch, but this particular reference said he was German, but he was very, very important to the plants that went into the Leiden Botanic Garden. But as we read down in here, it talks about his accessions in Japan, and he went into China as well. But he left with 800 specimens, live specimens of 500 plant species, and approximately 12,000 dried herbarium specimens, including 1,000 species. He also, unknown to the Japanese, had slipped out with some seeds of tea plants. And it was with these seeds that he was able to start the tea in Java, which at that time was a Dutch colony. He also introduced Japanese knotweed, a horribly invasive thing that I'm sure some of us walk out today and point to an invasive path. But he was also the person that brought that in by importing a single female plant. Now, the French missionaries were also very, very important in the early travels into China and the documentation, or at least the collection of many species. These 3 individuals, David, Delavet, and Farges, were all associated with the Natural Science Museum in Paris. And again, note the amount of material that these naturalists, oftentimes they're from the medical fields, many times they were a scientific community where really they weren't just plants people or medicinal people, they were an aggregation of the sciences. But under David, his his collections here brought in over 2,000 species of plants. Get down to Delavet, and his dedication resulted in the largest collections ever made, 200,000 specimens representing 400 species of alpine flora primarily, which 1,500 were new discoveries. And then Farges, much the same thing. He collected and preserved over 4,000 specimens. Just imagine the impact and the consequence of this massive introduction over these decades. Plants were being brought in. There was no record of what families they were in, how to grow them, what conditions they needed. They had to be sorted out as far as documentation, as far as what they were. So the scientific community, in essence, could find themselves overwhelmed with the amount of material coming in that they had no knowledge about. Another well-known collector, and in many cases, these collectors are recognized. Their names, like in this case, Henry, Acer Henry is the name. Their surnames are oftentimes associated with these. And once again, here in 15 years within China's borders, he went over there as a customs agent. He consigned to Kew Gardens 158,000 dried specimens, 6,000 species, 2,000 proved to be new to science. How does the scientific community deal with this type of influx? So because of all of this, it soon became quite clear, as E.H. Wilson coined in 1929, that China was the mother of gardens. And from the late 1700s until World War II, dozens of explorers from around the world traveled to China, bringing these plants in, documenting, introducing plants. In the United States, the Arnold Arboretum certainly took a leading role in supporting these. Now, Charles Sprague Sargent was the director of the Arnold Arboretum from 1873 to 1927. And he sent many expeditions into China, Korea, and Japan. Joseph Brock for one, Meyer Verdum, and Ernest Henry Chinese Wilson was probably the most significant in the sense of the volume of material. Sargent knew of Wilson for sure because Wilson had been working for the famous British nursery, James Veitch and Son. And he had gone into China, specifically sent by Veitch, looking for the Davidia. Davidia, I believe, had been first seen by Augustine Henry. Henry had seen the Davidia before it. Henry had also seen the but Veitch wanted Wilson to go in and specifically find the Davidia, which he did in great numbers. He also introduced then the first seeds of Acer in 1901. Those were brought into England. He went back for Sargent, I think, in 1907, and collected Grisium again. And a phenomenal tidbit that comes from that, up until recent times, almost every Acer in the Western cultivation derived from the plants produced from the seed collected by Wilson before 1910. Two introductions from this very rare plant. Even in China, it's not commonly found. It is a plant that, again, had very little genetic material, represented in cultivation. So Wilson in total made 4 trips to China and 2 to Japan between the dates of 1899 and 1919. And he collected over 1,000 new species, 17,000 photographs per herbarium specimen. Again, imagine going to the institution, primarily to the Arnold, but shared out by the Arnold to others, this much material coming in for this period. Wilson became the director of the Arnold Arboretum, and he grew up in a period of time when the motor car was a fairly new innovation, and he loved the motor car, and unfortunately met his demise in a crash that killed both him and his wife in 1930. Many plants from these early introductions never survived. The growers and horticultural institutions were often overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and the fact that the culture for many was unknown. The economic and physical impacts of World War II, World War I directed resources away from the cultivation of ornamental plants. Many new introductions were lost. I recall when I was studying in England, I went down to Exbury Gardens, which had been one of the Rothschild properties. And even into, the last 20, 30 years, there were plants that were sort of just being discovered as they began to carve their way through, or maybe after something had died, seedlings had regenerated of a plant that they did not know was there, that had come in there and been lost in the activities after World War II, where the garden had to be basically de-emphasized. Many seed collections represented limited genotypes and therefore lacked the genetic diversity. In cultivation, these plants could suffer from inbreeding and die out. Acer being a case in point, where limited genetic material had been introduced. So in 1981, my good friend Peter Bristol down here and Paul Meyer from the Morse Arboretum told me about an expedition being organized to Tibet by this man here, Roy Lancaster. And he threw out the net through a travel agency that did horticultural tours. And together he put together the group that included Tim Sorvig, now an landscape architect in Albuquerque, but at that time at Kew. Here's Roy, here's Carla Toyna from the Leiden Botanic Garden in Holland, Alan Leslie, the taxonomist for the Royal Horse Society, Charles Sanford, I think was a nurseryman, and this gal, I think, worked for the John Innes Institute. But anyway, here's Peter Bristol. So we went to Tibet in September of 1981. And the goal was an area that had been frequented by Joseph Rock in the 1920s, I think. And it was in the shadow of Mount Minyakanka or Gangashan, which at the time of Rock's travels here was thought to be 30,000 feet and the highest in the world. It turns out to be just under 25,000 and one of the top peaks in the world, but it's certainly not the tallest. So our base camp was at 11,300 feet. This was the typical morning when the Tibetans would bring in the pack animals and ask us where you wanted to ride to. The problem with that is every place we stepped was new to us. We didn't need a horse to take us there. So we'd ride on those wooden pack saddles, which were extraordinarily uncomfortable, and they were somewhat undersized for long-legged guys like Paul Meyer and myself. But we enjoyed the fact that this was the dynamics every morning in our camp. In 1925, Joseph Rock, when he was in these very same valleys, this is how it appeared to him. We were near the village of Liuba, the Tibetan village of Liuba, and our Chinese guides had translators so they could talk to the Tibetan people. One of our members became sun poisoned during our excursions, Ray Evison. You'll see a picture of Ray later on. He is with the Guernsey Clematis Company, an island of Guernsey, one of the world's leading producers of clematis or clematis hybrids. Raymond was sheltered down here in one of these buildings during the time of his recovery from sun poisoning. But this is how we saw it. This is what Wilson saw in 1908 in similar areas. These individuals carrying packs of tea, enormously heavy packs of tea that they would carry between Lhasa and wherever their destinations were and their sources. These were tea porters. In Liuba, one of the ladies, the Tibetan ladies that we saw, noticed the basket she's carrying. She's dumping out, again, I don't know the product she's dumping out, but these were the people that Rock saw in 28. Again, baskets of similar construction and terrain very similar and identical to what we were actually collecting. Children were fascinated by the fact that we were there. Remember, this was 1981. We had normalized relations with China only a few years before. There was no question that most of the people we met in Tibet and in some of the major Chinese cities had never seen Western before. So we attracted great crowds of people as we thumped around. They ran to in this case, into the fences where they'd have their yaks or their goats in behind, and they'd come and see us. And sometimes once they recognized what we were up to, they would bring us branches, seed-bearing branches, as in the case of these honeysuckles, one honeysuckle. Roy Lancaster, probably one of the best plantsmen in the world today, certainly well known as an author and as a lecturer. And Roy was basically our liaison for the horticultural side of this. We did not know much of what we saw. Roy had a good idea, but in every case, the institutions represented would keep extensive notes. All of the herbarium specimens that were taken, the plants were numbered and given accession numbers, notes as Roy is taking here. Though this was not on our trip, it represents what Roy did with all the trips he's been on. And here across the bottom of the page, you can see where he has the Japanese knotweed. I don't know what kind of notations he was making, but he was recording, in this case, all the plant associations that he was recording at different altitudes and under cultural conditions. Paul Meyer, now retired as the director of the Morse Arboretum, but here's Paul establishing the dried herbariums. We had to take herbarium presses and sheets of vellum, absorbent papers, and we had to, again, document everything that we were doing and collect seeds whenever possible. Here's Paul Meyer again on the right, and Peter Bristol putting the herbarium sheets into a press where they're going to be bound together and dried for safe transport. Now it says here that my internet connection is unstable, so I don't know what that's going to do to anybody who's having problems hearing me or might have problems. Am I still coming through all right?
You're coming through fine. Once in a while,
Okay.
we get a little bit of a scratch, but we can still understand you. So
Okay, thank you. Well, again, this first time it's flashed on my screen that I have an unstable connection.
keep rolling.
All right. So in the 1980s, Paul Meyer, Peter Bristol, again, the organizations that spoke about, the Morton Arboretum, and others put together the North American China Plant Exploration Consortium, the NACPEC, and working with Chinese institutions who then came to the United States for explorations of their own. These individuals went back and forth a number of times to help bring out some of these plants that had either limited genetic representation or new provenances needed to be sourced, and just also to help secure these plants places in ex situ locations for conservation. So this was a very important group. And oftentimes these groups would go into holy sites or into religious mountains where, again, agriculture and deforestation was not occurring as rapidly, because those are the places that had been set aside. So these are oftentimes important places for these groups coming with NAPPEC to go and find their materials. One of the trips, Charles Tubising, who was the horticulturist at Holden Arboretum, he was visiting on one of these expeditions, and he told a story about where they nearly had a terrific tragedy. And that is, as they drove along with a minivan full of individuals, a truck with logs was passing them or coming from the other direction to pass. One of the logs was not secure, and it was swinging wildly back across the center line. The driver tried to get off the road, and luckily the log that smashed into the side of their van was not going out, but coming back into the load, and all it accomplished doing was to basically snatch the door off the side of their van. So there's the log sticking itself into this door. Charles was the man sitting next to the door, and Charles is a pretty good sized fellow, and he said he basically threw himself onto the lap of the man next to him. And when he looked down, a bag of apples that had been on the floor, the seat next to him, had some of the apples sliced in half by the door being pulled off. So a major catastrophe narrowly averted here. But again, back in Rock's and Wilson's times, it was basically uncharted, no roads, a lot of warring tribes, lots of issues. Even today, conditions in China don't always allow for the safest, uneventful types of travel. Peter Del Tredici from the Arnold Arboretum. Here he's pictured with Acer Gricium. Again, mentioned that, and they were very, very concerned at the Arnold Arboretum about the limited genetics of the Acer Gricium. And as mentioned before, Wilson in 1901 and I think 1907 had been responsible for all of the genetic material in this country. If anybody, and Tom Drays will know the trees up there in Rochester, New York, you have Highland Park and you have Durand Eastman Park. The Acer Gricium in Highland Park were imported, I think, in 1904 directly from England from the Beach Nursery. Durand Eastman are probably the biggest Acer Gricium in the United States. I believe they're just enormous. And they came from Arnold, I believe, in 1930. But again, these plants and those derived from them represent very limited genetic material. And I think 2015, NACPEC members wanted to get into China, and they wanted to document as many provenances, in fact, as much seed as they could of Acer Gricium. And I believe to a greater or lesser extent, they were successful in doing that. Chris Bachtel from Morton Arboretum, again with another rare species of maple, Acer barbonerve. They also took their trips into Korea, and here you see forests, including Acer triflorum, the trifoliate maple, one of the trifoliate maples. They went into South Korea, and here's Camellia japonica, taken from the most northerly known location for this species, at least the most northerly known in South Korea. It could go further north, I guess. This is as far north as they could find this species in South Korea. Looking for a hardier form. It's proven, I think, to be sort of touchy in Philadelphia, not necessarily rock hardy by any means. Now, this talk's going to move between individuals and institutions as I sort of saw fit to do so. And this begins a bit going into Belgium with the institution called Arboretum Comtout and Arboretum Heimelreich, which were begun by Robert and Jelena de Belder. We know the de Belders and Comtout because of their emphasis with witch hazels. They are the registration authority for witch hazels. And they also, though, have an enormous collection of cherries and salix and any great number of things. Chris Lane is the world's leading authority on Hamamelis. We work with him a lot and getting some of the new stuff. And so all this inspiration that came out of the de Belders' development of their collection there allowed them to add not necessarily a teaching program, but where they brought a lot of young people into to work. Here's Mikanori Agisu, one of the more well-known international individuals. Mikanori was actually at Wisley when I was studying at Wisley Gardens in England. Mikanori was a student there as well. And years later, the last time I saw him, when he received the Veitch Medal of Honor in England, he told me he had personally discovered 50 new species of plants. We'll talk about a couple of those as we go forward. But Mikanori was one. Here in this country, Claire Sawyer, Tracy DeSabato Oust, they all worked with Madame de Belder at Camphout. Ursula Buchan, the British garden writer, she was there. Carla Toyna from the University of Leiden Botanic Garden, she was there. Any number of young people passed through the gardens at Camphout in Himmelreich. We know Madame de Belder, actually most of the de Belder family members have witch hazels named after them. This is Jelena, one of the earliest ones named out of their program, and quite an exciting plant. It also keeps the inspiration going for seeking new witch hazels. And so here is the form of our native Hamamelis virginiana, Mohawk Red. This is a selection found in the Mohawk Indian Reservation in New York. We know that Virginiana is typically a yellow flowered species, but I think we now have 5 or 6 forms here, all wild collected in various parts of the United States, that are shaded these either orange, rosy purple or orangey tones. In 2004, a new species. So you have to sort of exclaim, how can we have new species of woody plants found in our own country? But in 2004, down in Mississippi at Camp Shelby, which was Soto National Forest and used by the military for training, a new species of witch hazel was found. The Missouri Botanic Garden determined that it was indeed unique, gave it standing, and it became Hamamelis ovalis. And right now, Tony Aiello and other members of Longwood and the National Arboretum are working to find the full range and the extent of the diversity and the genetic importance of this particular species and how it fits into the other native species we have in this country, Virginiana and Venalis. Here's some of the color forms found with ovalis. Back to Mikanori. Mikanori, as I said, has found at least 50 plants, to his credit, that are new to science, or at least new to documentation. One of the more recent ones is this particular Daphne. He doesn't believe that this one's going to be much hardier than Zone 8. It's on the red list. I'm not even sure it's in the United States. He said if he got back to this part of China, again, he might try to find me some seed. But this is a plant that he observed on a hillside as he traveled down a particular road. This was not off in the wild, someplace, just on a slump coming down from a hillside. And when they documented it and taxonomists reviewed it, they said, this has never been described before. So this became Daphne agisu. Imagine, though, a Daphne with heads that large and a pure yellow. I can't imagine what it'd be like if it has a scent. It'd just be extraordinary. Mikanori also was a person that used to contact me for years at Christmas time, and he'd say, do you have Parochia subequalis? I don't know what this species is, Mikanori. Well, in 1998, he had gone into China. He'd gone into a part of China that was highly developed. There was actually a caves there, a big recreational area. A friend of mine from up in Buffalo, New York said, oh yes, I've been there with my family. It wasn't because of the trees, it was because of the recreational site. Well, in the mountains around this site, there is a fairly good population of a plant that had formerly been considered a Hamamelis, but then taken out, considered to be now truly standing as a Parodia. It's called Subequalis, the Chinese Parodia. There's Peter Del Tredici in China at the same place near these scenic caves that Mikanori had gone to. And the long and the short of it is, Mikanori brought this plant out of China. Arnold went there and brought 2 samples out, so that makes 4 times. And the Chinese at the Beijing Botanic Garden sent it once to growers in Belgium. So this species has left China 5 times by via roots of sort of institutional or collectors having a hand in it. It's on the red list. It's only known maybe it's 5 or 6 locations, 7 locations in China. There's only about 145 known fruiting specimens of this plant. And everything that's in this country so far is from only one of those 6 or 7 locations. The other ones have never been at least introduced into the West. And they're trying to conserve them because each of them have fairly specific and distinct genetic characteristics. They're trying to make sure they don't inbreed and lose them. Redbuds, certainly redbuds are popular. A lot of people think of us as redbuds because we've had a hand in a few redbud cultivars being developed. But redbuds are certainly exciting plants, good plants for the East, good hardy plants, a lot of variation. And there are certainly many, many, many new forms of redbud. Our case had been going up in New York, up near Tom Draves' location. In 1991, we were asked to take a look at a weeping redbud in the garden of Cornelia Connie Puggy. And we recognized it as being something that had never been introduced before, or eventually took possession of the plant and brought it back to Madison, Ohio. But here was Connie with her original tree where it had grown nearly 30 years in her yard. The story she told me was that her mother had gone to Florida with her brother on a vacation somewhere on the route. They're driving back from Florida to Buffalo. They stopped and somehow got that little plant. She arrived back home. She told her daughter, here, unpack the car and take that little potted plant out and put it in our garden. And that's what Connie did. And 30 years later, it was brought to our attention. And eventually, Connie and I reached an agreement where we could buy the plant. And here it is, planted at the back of my own. Now, what's significant about this plant is that Lavender Twist is extremely fertile. It yields pollen well, and it accepts pollen well. Redbuds are typically somewhat self-infertile, so to have a good seed set, you need cross-pollination with something that's distinctly different. And so Lavender Twist, in our case, we began to propagate it. It's all over the world now. It has become a fixture, but it's not the only weeping redbud out there. We're going to show some pictures later on of a couple of distinct forms that arose by seed, but it lent its genetics, the genetics for weeping traits, it lent those into some purposeful, deliberate hybrids. Lavender Twist won a gold medal to Chelsea Show a few years after it was found. That was a great honor to be able to go over there and see it with the gold medal. But for our part, we decided we wanted to create a Lavender Twist with white flowers. So we took the selection Royal White. There are white redbuds, and we crossed Royal White with Lavender Twist, and we created what we call Vanilla Twist. Now, because the white is a recessive trait and the weepiness is a recessive trait as well, we had to go into a second generation where we evaluated 900 seedlings before we chose the one that we named. But again, this is the first, and as far as we know, the only white weeping redbud in cultivation today. Denny Werner down in North Carolina, Denny had big ideas for developing redbuds. And so he began to explore and using the very fertile traits of Lavender Twist for, I don't know if he used it exclusively as a pollen parent or as a seed parent, but he began to breed for form and for coloration. And he had to go into the second generation for everything that he accomplished. So one of the first things he accomplished using Lavender Twist was Ruby Falls. And here clearly we have a plant that was bred in with forest pansy. So now we have two weeping forms of redbud. And then using either silver cloud or floating cloud. I'm not quite sure what he used for his, basically the variegated pattern. He created a weeping red water. Now, because there's so little chlorophyll in this, at least not initially in the season, it's a weak grower, it can burn, but it's a cute plant, not very common in the trade anymore just because it's not vigorous, but he created white water. But then he kept on going and using Hearts of Gold, which was a red bud that was not bred, it was found in some locations just as either nursery grown or wild plant. So here we have this yellow red bud, yellow foliage red bud. He took that plant and he crossed it and he created Golden Falls. Now we have yet another red bud that is weeping, and it got its weeping characteristic from Lavender Twist. And here's the Rising Sun, which is a similar plant to Golden Falls next to a Ruby Falls. The Rising Sun he took and he crossed, I think, with Forest Pansy, and he created this particular plant called Flamethrower. Flamethrower has only been out 2 or 3 years. And I will mention, because 2 people called me this spring about it, they asked what I knew about a weeping flamethrower. And apparently in the breeding to create flamethrower, there were a number of seedlings, some of which were quite pendulous, but they were not released not meant to be released when they were in this country. And propagation material was sent to Israel, and some of that propagation material came back to the United States. And this year or last year, some of these weeping flamethrowers made it into the marketplace. I'm not sure it's ever going to be widely distributed, but I have seen it, not in leaf, but I have seen the form. It's definitely weeping, and I just can't wait to see weeping flamethrower as this particular type of foliage characteristic. So that's yet another weeping plant that came out of lavender trees. And there's flamethrower. Independent of Denny Werner, but friends and perhaps cooperators, we had Tom Rainey. And Tom Rainey began a redbud breeding program as well as other plants. And Tom created this particular plant, Carolina Sweethearts, which is a real beauty. It's a great plant. And it's not weeping though, it's had more. Now, it's certainly possible to find redbuds in the wild, or at least in nursery production facilities grown from seed that have interesting traits. Here's one called Ace of Hearts. See how the leaves are two ranked along the stem, very, very regimented. Here's a row of Ace of Hearts being grown in Tennessee by Harold Neubauer, one of the country's leading growers of new selections. He's a great man for evaluating the characteristics and potentials of new selections. In the background are, I think, Hearts of Gold. A plant that was found in Kentucky, I believe, is called Alley Cat. This is a better balance of characteristics than either floated out or silver cloud. I like this a lot better. It does not burn as much. Appalachia Red was found along the Appalachia Trail. You can see how much of it's sort of a neon fuchsia color, how it compares to a standard redbud coloration behind, almost makes the traditional redbud look muddy. This is such a bright and intense color. Burgundy Hearts. I don't know the history on Burgundy Hearts, but it's supposed to be better than forest pansy. So we've just gotten some and we're going to try it to see how it holds up in our summer heat. Pauline Lily, another plant found in Kentucky. This is actually an albiform, so it would be a white redbud, but it's not purely white. It does have a bit of a pink apple blossom blush. And there are two others like that. One's called Cotton Candy that looks almost identical to it. And there's a third one that came up here as a sport. We haven't named yet. So again, this is not a rare condition now that we know that there's three forms that are similar, but this is the first one that's been in the trade and out there the longest. Pink Heartbreaker found over in Pennsylvania. This is another weeping redbud grown from seed. It has a very different form than Lavender Twist. It's certainly architecturally, it does a weeping job a little bit differently. It's a good plant. Pink Pom-Poms is an extraordinary selection. We have a plant in the trade called Flame, which is a double, almost like a Kwanzaa cherry type flower. Flame was crossed with Oklahoma. It was just basically a random cross. It was not deliberate. And the seed that was collected from that plant produced this particular flower. So imagine pink pom-poms. That's an extraordinary blossom. Tennessee Pink, found as a nursery grown plant by Harold Neubauer in Tennessee, was as part of a production that where he found a plant that was a lot more pink. There's a lot less blue, a lot less purple in the flower of Tennessee Pink. And so this is not as vibrant as Appalachia Red, but it's a much more clear pink than Appalachia Red. Traveler was found by Dan Osage down in San Marcos, Texas, in a seed flat. This is the Texan form of our Cercis canadensis, often referred to as Cercis reniformis, but this is also known as Cercis canadensis variety texensis. This plant, I'm told, is sterile both ways. It has not been able to do anything as far as enhancing breeding. I'm not sure that that's the case, but I've been told that it's not that prolific as far as being able to produce. But it's certainly very glossy. For here in Ohio, it's not as hardy as we need for our northern climate. Everybody knows Mike Durr and his reference text, his lectures, his promotions, his enthusiasm. Just everybody knows who he is because he's in the industry, particularly after he's left the faculty down at the University of Georgia. He just nonstop still working at it, doing a lot of breeding, doing a lot of hybridizing, doing a lot of selections and evaluations. One of the plants that Mike bred early on was Hydrangea arborescens Bella Anna. Hydrangea arborescens, the native plant, is white flowered, but it was known to have some, I won't say localized populations, but the genetics were in there to find some plants with pink. So he began to work on that, boost the amount of pink, and created this plant, and did so at the same time when Tom Rainey back in North Carolina was doing the same thing under licensing with Proven Winners, and he created Invincible Spirit. Since then, Tom has released Invincible Spirit 2, which is even brighter than. So we now have at least 3 arborescens types that are pink. And the one thing with arborescens, it's bone hardy. It will not get clobbered back like the hortensia types. And Mike has been working a lot with hortensias. Here in Ohio, and only a half mile from our place, and Dan and Jim got to visit here last year. And again, it's a great place, I think, for you to consider as a future spring trip. We had David Leach, who before his death put his property into the auspices of the Holden Arboretum. Just before he passed away, David had Dr. Steve Krebs come on board as the new director. He was there at least 25 years, I'm going to guess, and he is now retired, and his position has been filled with Connor Ryan. Connor is a young guy ready to tackle the breeding goals that David set in place that Steve assisted with. So again, a great place, only a half mile from our nursery, where David's efforts, I think David was 50 years, 7 generations in 50 years in creating something like 150 different varieties of rhododendrons and azaleas. Again, a principled man of somewhat independent means. He didn't do it to make a living. He did it just for the enhancement of horticulture. David at one point was the president of the American Hort Society, helped obtain Riverview River Farm down DC. Anyway, he was a mover and a shaker, and did a huge contribution for the advancement of horticulture with his 50 years of rhododendron breeding. He also worked with magnolias, so we had Golden Gift and Golden Gift and Coral Lake and Legacy and Legend. Oh gosh, Ivory Chalice. He did a number of magnolias. He's very fond of magnolias as well. And he also, though he didn't breed popcorn, he did take the seed from a neighbor's property, grew them on, and selected popcorn from that. And despite what you might read about popcorn's ultimate height being 6 or 7 feet, I think the original popcorn now is around 12 to 14 feet tall. Popcorn does get big, but its advantage is that it's pretty much completely sterile. Not 100%, but pretty much for all practical purposes is a sterile plant and not lending itself to casting seed all over. Another local individual or family were the Zampinis. Jim Zampini, now deceased, late 3 years ago. Upon his retirement, he worked with his daughter Maria and her company called Upshoot. Jim was out there promoting, finding just a legend as far as it came to working with new plant materials and introducers. And Maria has kept that up with working Upshoot, writing promotions, and helping breeders bring their plants to market. One of the plants that I like very much, just because we like witch hazels so much, is a couple years before he passed away, Jim brought me a couple of witch hazels that were not in the trade and probably still are not represented well in the trade. The one that I think is the more dynamic of the two is called Golden Eclipse, Colazam. And Golden Eclipse can begin this transition into fall color in August. It has probably the most outrageous of the complete season coloration. Now, there are some that maybe are more outrageous in fall color, but the fact that this begins so early is a great asset for that late summer to color. The flower is small, not a great consequence. It's a spring bloomer and it's nice, but it's really grown for the Father Fiala, Catholic priest in Medina, Ohio. Father Fiala was well known for his breeding work with lilacs. He also worked with crabapples. His books, monographs on lilacs and crabapples both were reference texts for every library back in his time. At the time of his death, his collection at Falconsteep was basically broken apart and distributed, and in many cases perhaps not maintained with any integrity. But during his time, he was a very, very important breeder and contributor to the world of lilacs. Locally, we have Kurt Hansen, one of many people in this country who are breeding daylilies. Kurt also breeds magnolias and hellebores. he's just very hands-on, and he just loves what he can create by bringing diversity together. Quintonic Gardens is quite a contributor to the new Hemera Caliph. Daryl Lapps used to be at Longwood, living in Chad's Ford, I think. Daryl is now up in, I think, Minnesota, but he's well known for working a lot of his hybrids into Centerton with their Happy Ever Appster, Reblooming Daylilies. Daryl had a great line and a great contributor and a great individual. Roy Clem had Clem Nursery in Barrington, Illinois. He established Song Sparrow in Avalon, Wisconsin. Roy was a great plantsman. I mean, Roy's still living, but his nurseries are now closed. But Roy contributed a huge amount of diversity into the inventories of the nurseries that he managed, as well as he was a great breeder of daylilies and peonies. Great contribution. Here's Ray Everson from Guernsey Clematis Group. Whenever I see Ray, and typically I'd see him at the Mant Show every January, and he'd say to somebody, and here's one of those chaps who helped carry me when I was ill from our campsite down into the village where I had to recover. Well, I don't remember having to carry Ray in there, but I know somebody had to. And because he was not able to go off onto our forays into the mountains, we all decided to look for clematis that he could take back. And I think we found a total of 30 different species of clematis on that trip. And so I've said to him in the years since, Raymond, how much of what the genetics that you brought back from our efforts have you been able to work into your new hybrids? And I think the answer was nothing. So whatever became of those, I don't know, but certainly they did not lend themselves into these great floriferous beauties that Raymond is well known for. Dr. Elwyn Orton, now retired from Rutgers, but Elwyn came up with the stellar series of dogwoods, which were landmark pieces at the time. He carried on his work and created Venus, which has absolutely the biggest bracts of any dogwood out there. It's a terrific plant, and Elwyn has now retired, but the breeding program is continuing at Rutgers. Tom Molnar, I don't have a picture of Tom, but Tom is doing a great job with dogwoods as well as filberts, disease-resistant filberts. And Tom's probably his introduction that everybody would know is a dogwood called Scarlet Fire, a great pink pusa. Now we're getting into individuals who, through their professional activities, have a chance to find things and bring it into the market. And again, it's one of those roots that, again, it wasn't bred, it wasn't just stumbled upon in a nursery, but was actually found. Here we have Tom Draves, and I know he's watching from one of these corner screens. And Tom is an arborist in Buffalo, third generation arborist. Excuse me, he gets called upon all the time to remove offending trees. And sometimes Tom will call me up and say, well, gosh, I don't want to take that tree down because it's too special. So let's get it propagated first. So here's Tom coming up the steps in his arboretum, but he has shown me this witch's broom in a sugar maple. Not a lot of commercial value, but we propagated it. The tree has since, I think, fallen, or the broom has fallen. If you go to Tom's arboretum, you'll see a sample of this we propagated so that he could conserve the genetics of this particular plant. Tom brought me up to Buffalo one time, or actually out to Attica, and showed me a planting of honey locust along one of the streets in town. And one of them was this particular pyramidal form, Thornus pyramidal form. And here it is in full leaf. And this is a plant that Tom and I jointly have introduced under the name of Street Keeper. Again, at this point, is probably the most upright of any honey locust. Tom brought me up there also one time to see a plant that he'd been watching for 20 years, and it turns out to be a weeping and contorted sycamore. The commercial value of that is more arguable than on a honey locust, but it's an interesting plant, serious plant, and we have been able to get a patent on it. And when we came up with the name, of course, names are a little bit of everything when it comes to marketing. Tom said, let's put our surnames together, sort of make a little crisp combination of our two names. And so Brot is what it sort of looked like until someone came in and says, what a lovely plant. I love the fact that you have Drobroy. So now it's been given an air of sophistication, and we now hope that it has a chance to catch on. Finding things in the nursery is something that I'm always looking for myself. Mandarin in a group of dogwoods. Mandarin Jewel is a white flowered plant. It's more upright. It lacks anthocyanin, so its foliage is a bit lighter in color. but its real claim to fame are these very lush and I must say very tasty, a large yellow fruit sort of mature into a pumpkin color, found in the nursery though. Conifers, anybody in the conifer business recognizes the value of dwarfs. And we see witches' brooms all over the country. And here's an example of a witch's broom up in a white pine. But Sid Waxman, the late Sid Waxman from the University of Connecticut at Storrs, he did brooms one step further. He didn't just propagate from the brooms, from the broom itself. He took cones from the brooms and he propagated the seed from the cone. So he went one step beyond the actual collecting from a broom. Here's part of his trial field at Storrs. And I can't tell you exactly how we could break down each row into being what it is, but I think you can see the sort of the size, the associations inferred by shape and growth rate and the overall size. And that is probably everything in an individual row or gathering probably are seedlings from the same plant. So Sid went forward, he evaluated them. He had tours, obviously, educating people about the value of brooms and the way he approached it with his work. And a number of his plants have been introduced into the trade. Here's one called Old Softy. Now, we have obviously institutions, we have collectors, we have any number of people who are sort of stumbling onto plants. And this is one that actually Tom Drace had found up near Buffalo, and he sent the wood to me. And he says, "What are we going to do about this Magnolia tripetala with these unusual yellow leaves?" Well, I didn't have any understock, so I turned to two propagators in Tennessee, Alex Neubauer and his father Harold, and they're great propagators. And even though this particular combination might not survive indefinitely on Magnolia virginiana, it was able to be grafted on there and survive long enough for us to move forward with it, to evaluate it and see just what was causing this type of variegation, if it was worth keeping and if it was stable. So there have to be people willing to do this. In today's marketplace, with fewer and fewer propagators, with more propagators concerned about the bottom line, it isn't easy to find propagators as willing as the Neubauers have been to step up and do these types of customized propagation. Obviously, here you have two plants in the middle of a field of Magnolia virginiana. Not many people will do that. So what these folks have done and continue to do is invaluable for the resources of gaining new plant materials in the market. I mentioned this picture here because we don't think of Israel so much as a nursery state, at least I never did, until because of the weeping redbuds. I had a visit from Hochberg Nurseries. Omer Hochberg on the left came to visit us and said he was probably I won't say the primary redbud producer in Europe, but I think he certainly must be close. And he is producing here Ruby Falls. Look at the consistency, look at the size. And as far as production technique, I want to point out that this plant, if it's grown the same way and growing the same way as it would in the United States, what he studied next to is a 1-year whip. So the previous summer, he had planted his understock, his seedlings. In the summer of that year, he had gone out there and grafted the selections that he wanted to propagate into that. The single bud healed, spent the winter basically dormant and attached. The next spring, as growth began, Omer's crew would have cut that understock off just above the bud, and then it would start to grow up vigorously. Because it's a weeper, it has to be staked to be running on the ground like a rope. But at any rate, so the growth that is there next to Omar probably represents something that would have started in his conditions maybe in April, and I suspect he's standing there in August, the type of growth. So that's how most young plants that are grown by budding, grown as whips, they're a 1-year-old top on a 2 or 3-year-old. But we need nurseries. We need nurseries who are willing to experiment and trial, and then it falls into a specialist who can do some of these things better than others because of climate, technique, skill sets, any number of things. But this is a good picture taken in Israel of a very good redbud producer. And then we need to have people like Roy Lancaster, as you see on the left, and Carla Toyna, my Dutch friend from the Leiden Botanic Garden. Though both are in their 80s now and not traveling like they used to, they're still advocates, they're still promoters, they're still lecturers, they are still writers, they are still encouraging young people and all people for that matter to continue getting in to horticulture at whatever level they're able to participate in. And then it ends with Mikanori, obviously waving us, goodbye, good luck. Hope to see you in the field one of these days. And with that, I'll conclude this presentation.
That was wonderful, and I really appreciate your walking us through all of these wonderful breeders and new species. Let's see if we have any questions. There were some comments that came in through the chat about how people love the pink pom-pom redbud and the Tennessee pink. One of the questions that's come in over the chat is, what is your favorite book on plant collecting and exploration? Barclay's asking that question.
Next one, please.
You know, I don't have an exhaustive number of books, and my problem is I collect books and find no time to read them. You know, I've got some of E.H. Wilson's early books. I've got some E.M. Cox's early books on rhododendrons. I've got Roy Lancaster's a plant collector in China. I mean, Roy Lancaster wrote with a lot of vibrance. He's done it, he's seen it, he's photographed it, he brings people in and places in. He does a great job of documenting it. So Roy Lancaster, I will say the first time I ever met Roy Lancaster, he came to Wisley to give a lecture, and Paul Meyer had worked in England and actually inspired me to go work in England as well. Paul worked in a commercial operation where Roy Lancaster was the horticulturist. I went to work for a botanical garden where people like Roy would come and lecture. And the first time he came to lecture us, after the program, the director's secretary came up to me and says, "What did you think of Mr. Lancaster?" And my answer was, "I don't think this man can be real." In the sense, he is so, he's so effusive, he's just so energetic, he's so dynamic that nobody can live this life 24/7. Well, he does, he did. I've traveled with him, I've stayed at his home, I've been with him many times, and that is exactly who he is. And he writes much the same way. So I'd say something by Roy Lancaster, pick a focus, that title seems to mean to you, but he writes very, very well. And then E.H. Wilson from back in 1924, 29, right in there, his book, The Mother of China, The Mother of Gardens, is another great book that talks about exploration. Joseph Rock wrote about them, George Forrest wrote. A lot of these old these old expedition leaders, these people who are mentioned here, they all wrote in their retirement years, they wrote. And often it was biased with their types of trips in mind. But again, those early ones I like because they're the men who did it. A lot of the more contemporary works are those who have compiled those types of stories into their version of, you know, the Plant Quest. So that's not a good answer, perhaps whoever answered it, but that's how I approach it.
That was great. Does anybody else have any other questions? I see that Phil, you unmuted yourself. Do you have a question?
If I could chime in, can you hear me? This is Phil.
Yep, go ahead.
So Tim, I wanted to comment on that, what you just said. It really resonated with me about reading the old books. I have recently started reading Reginald Ferrer, and I've known about him for years and seen his books in libraries. And he's from 1915, and he's traveled in these high reaches of China. And I haven't really gotten into a whole lot of meat about the plants he's found, but the way he writes about the people and the customs and the weather conditions and the landscapes, if you're strictly there to mine the plant information, you're not going to maybe get it. But this guy it's like Roy's book. It is so entertaining to read as a travelogue. And especially of the time of how they didn't have automated, you know, they're on the backs of mules and things. So this may not help us today with some of the newer plants that we're interested in, but just reading some of these travels of over 100 years ago and how some of these plants may have come into cultivation is fascinating to me.
We used to, Wisley's in the town, well, RHS Gardens are in the town of Wisley, and down the street 7 miles was Guildford, and the second biggest bookshop in England was in Guildford. And every weekend the students would certain students would always be found in the bookshop, just going over every book they could find on horticulture. So I started collecting those horticultural texts almost 50 years ago. And I have to admit, I have more texts than I can ever read. But I think I have Ferrer's Last Journey and The Rainbow Bridge and The Land of the Blue Poppy. I think those are Ferrer books.
Yes, they are.
And, you know, those are great titles. The Land of the Blue Poppy. My God, who doesn't want to read that? And the Rainbow Bridge. I mean,
I'm
that's
reading,
all of
I'm
that-
reading the Rainbow Bridge right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll probably have to go home tonight and pull my copy out of the dusty corner it's in and try to catch up with you.
Oh,
But,
it goes easy.
I will say, this is Jim, I'll say this. Places like ABE Books, the online things, you can find these old books reasonably easily and reasonably cheaply. And it's well worth it. I keep them in business.
I do too.
And Barkley, I see that you had some questions. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask them? Barkley doesn't have a microphone, so I will ask for her. She said that she gets a lot of books from bookfinder.com. She was wondering if you take or record growing advice from the local guides and gardeners when you're out plant collecting.
I believe that for instance, if you go online and you Google that NACPEC group, and I think in Arnolia, Michael Dossman and Tony Aiello wrote a recap of that 2015 on the Search Acer Gricium and other plants from that trip. I think they speak very often and very favorably of the relationship and the liaison between the local guides. Now, you have to find, even back in Wilson's time, it said like Wilson worked very, very well with local people. He treated the people in the tribes with respect, where Henry wasn't quite as nice. And at one point, instead of sending his collections or his herbariums out, they chucked them in the river or something like that. So those people always had to rely on local resources to be able to have access, or they hired them to go out during the dormant season, not dormant season, into the autumn to collect the seed. Again, recognize that if you're traveling in the spring, you see the blossoms, but if you're there in the fall, you see the seed, but have no clue what it was. So many times they'd have to take records, make good notes, and send their collectors out. And when we were in China, we did exactly that. We didn't have any local horticultural people with us, but and the reason for that is to get into China at that time, you had to go in with either China Travel if you were a tourist, the Chinese Mountaineers if you were a mountaineer type person, the Chinese Academy of Sciences if you were in science disciplines. And our sponsor happened to be the Chinese Mountaineers. So they were good about bringing us pack horses and a ride, but there weren't any horticultural liaisons with that particular group. We had to sort of take our own notes. But yours is a good question. And really, provenance data and anything you can get from the locals is always going to be important when you're dealing with your plants after the fact.
That's really helpful information. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments?
Tim, are you interested in a columnar Kusa or a 3/4 size Dawn Redwood?
Always looking for plants that are variations from the known theme. We're currently looking at a couple of fastigiate kusas, dwarf kusas for sure. And though I didn't talk about it yet, we're looking at a columnar kusa that's white and green variegated that's pretty distinct. So we have always an ongoing list. The problem, Phil, becomes how do we vet these things? When the lavender twist was found, when street keeper was found, when the weeping sycamore was found, we were pretty sure there weren't anything else like that in any species of that type.
Right.
So we knew that there was not a whole lot of need to evaluate it to vet it against something else. But when you're getting into these dogwoods, there are so many dogwoods today that vetting a new introduction really takes a lot of time, and many people aren't prepared to do the proper vetting. So we're all the time looking at things that, as you described, are worth looking at because they might be just the best niche filler out there, but we don't know that yet. So I guess that's sort of a yes answer.
Okay. Well, sometime we can talk. I can talk to you about these things that I found.
Okay, Phil, that'd be great.
one thing, Tim has been growing grafts of alcova, which is an autumn witch hazel that Alice Nicholson had. And I believe, I'm praying that I got the center, not a shoot, an offshoot, but that may come up available for grabsies. So if anybody has seen the original alcova when Alice still had the alcova mansion, know that it is there at Brotzman's.
Good. And we also have one, I think Tony Aiello probably has, maybe still has access, and there is a plant growing at Brookside.
I think it was mentioned in some of the correspondence, Jim, between Alice and yourself and me, that there could have been an influence of understock there, but if it was purchased back all those years ago as Virginiana, there's not much of a chance, or shouldn't have been much of a chance that the
It would
Virginia
have been
that should
grafted.
have been grafted. There should have been a seedling. And for that, I think anybody looking at that plant in the autumn or comparing the form of the leaves in the summer should be able to, again, pretty well determine that it's all the same plant. So maybe you don't have to worry as much as you are that you got the wrong part of it.
Hmm.
But
Well,
it did probably.
not to air my own dirty laundry, but remember, I gave you a bundle of Corylopsis too, not knowing the difference.
Well, that I take that with a grain of salt. I remember one time that I was in England, I was collecting Corylopsis, and I sent it to a leading nurseryman who grew more varieties than anybody that I knew at the time. And I came to see how they had done, and they had put them on Corylus because it sounded similar.
Oh my God.
And of course, nothing came out of that Corylus effort that year.
Guess not. So Tim, I have a phenomenon that I've observed and I'm most curious about. We were able to get hold of a plant of Cercis chinensis Shibamichi red, which is essentially the same kind of color on chinensis as Appalachian red. And it's seeded in the garden. And the gardener collected a bunch of seedlings, which did turn out to come true, interestingly. But there was one in the batch that grew strangely. And it was in the same flower bed as a native Cercis canadensis. That color transferred to a seedling of Cercis canadensis. I just thought that was very strange. And it looks functionally identical to Appalachian red, but it was a seedling out of pods collected off of Cercis chinensis.
Is that so strange if it got pollinated by the red and the red was dominant?
That's all I can guess. Because
that's the kind of question that Denny Werner or Tom Rainey are better positioned, because they will understand the genetics of that.
Yeah. It just blew me away, because I expected the seedlings of chinensis to be mostly true, but then when the neighboring canadensis got in there and it turned out to be the same color red, I didn't know what to do with it.
Well, that's conserve it for sure, and before a rabbit or a tree limb gets to it, have a couple of propagated.
It's been planted out.
Talk to Harold and see if he'll put you a couple of new ones in reserve.
Yeah. Anyway, I thought that was pretty strange. I'd never seen that before. I didn't even know the two species crossed.
We can't grow chinensis up here.
Oh.
So at least I've got a couple of small plants of Kay's Early Hope, and for me, it's going to be a lot of hope that the plant does okay.
Well, there's some wonderful thank yous in the chat, and this has been a fantastic presentation. For those of us who have not had a chance to meet you, but have ordered from you many, many times, it is great to have had the chance to meet you virtually and hear about these plant explorations. So thank you very much for a wonderful talk tonight. I will send you the recording afterwards, and we'll get it posted to our site, to our club site. So thank you so much.
Well, thank
And-
you thanks for having me, Olivia. And again, all of us in our own way are all interested in doing the same thing. So this was just one version. I could be told 1,000 different ways.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Tim. It's like having an old friend visit with you.
Indeed, it has been, Phil. Thank you so much for being there.
Great.